think some of the things you can take out of testing is just overall looking at the balance of the cars. The McLaren is like a combination of a lot of the really good things from a lot of successful fast cars. Lewis Hamilton is one of the greatest drivers of all time. Okay, let's just get that off the table. And if there's anybody that can extract something out of a car, it's him. You're putting in so much front steering input. The nose is responding incredibly quickly, and the rear simply just can't catch up. The other aspect of this is that there's an aerodynamic component to this. So every car has what's called a center of pressure. Aerodynamicists have done where you've got a model of a car and you can see how the air is moving over the car. You see all the vortices that are being generated.
Hello, and welcome to yet another fantastic episode of Georgie's Stripping and Dipping podcast. I'm your unusual co-host, the formidable F1 Blag, and today I'm joined by none other than one half of the Techhead F1 podcast, Dr.Obbs. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Blag. How are you doing? Actually, I am 1/3. We can't forget about Molly. Molly is
Wow. Overestimated, yeah.
back, yeah.
No, my bad. Okay, well, I rounded 0.33 up to 0.5, so I'm going to just bring it back down to 0.33. How are you doing? How's your day been?
Yeah, doing good. I'm really excited about the Bahrain Grand Prix. I mean, I think we got a really great little taste of what's to come with testing this year. So I was very excited that testing was televised. Although, it was kind of odd for me that people were talking about how testing was boring, but maybe we can get into that later. But yeah, I'm ready for the Bahrain Grand Prix. So I think the energy of the weekend is keeping me going.
And we should let the listeners know. So if you're at home or on the move listening to this, we're recording this on a Thursday evening UK time. So we've had the press conferences, but we've not seen any track running for the race weekend. So we're perfectly situated to trick Dr. Obbs into making all sorts of predictions that when you're listening to this, you can say, you got that completely wrong. No pressure there.
Brilliant. That's one of the beautiful things about doing predictions or taking, F1 hot takes is that whenever you're wrong, it's kind of like your bum is just sort of hanging out there for everybody to see. So it's wonderful.
And I must say that your co-host Bryson was very difficult to get a prediction from. He's much smarter than me, so I would be sort of saying, which car do you think will be most similar at the tests? Because we recorded an episode just on the eve of testing, and he gave me a couple of sort of quite straight and direct answers, but he's very good. He's media trained, you might say. I don't know
Yeah,
how's your media training?
I mean, it's not as good as Bryson's. I mean, Bryson, he definitely does not like predictions. We've pretty much settled on that for our own podcast, but yeah, I don't mind. I mean, Blag. I mean, we've done Twitter Spaces before. I've given a few hot takes.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, those that are at home listening to the podcast, your incentive to stick around is that we're not going to give you Dr. Obbs's hot takes just yet. We'll wait a minute and then we'll come back to them. So it's brilliant. So as we record this on a Thursday evening and we're all looking forward to Friday practice, I've taken the day off work, sort of coincidentally, but definitely opens me up to be on my couch watching Sky Sports F1 throughout the day. So we don't know what the cars are going to be like, what they're going to look like actually if they've been out in the upgrades and testing. So perhaps we'll start there. Help me break down testing. So we saw, Red Bull kind of not really breaking their stride, but definitely out front. Would you agree on that? They look pretty comfortable.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, testing is, and I'm sure anybody that talks about testing kind of says this is always one of those things where it's really difficult to take a lot of very concrete things out of it. But I think some of the things you can take out of testing is just overall looking at the balance of the cars because You never know if people are running in, lower power engine modes or lower, energy deployment settings, or they're running with heavy fuel, or they've got the ride height higher. They do all these kinds of little tricks to try to hide their true pace. But the one thing that you can't hide is how stable a car is, because these cars are going incredibly fast, pulling incredible amounts of G's through the corners, in the braking zones, in the traction zones, and that is really what you can see. So I would say yes, generally the Red Bull looked very planted over the course of the 3 days. And there were other cars that looked very impressive as well. There's a lot of buzz out there about the Aston Martin, the AMR 23. It looked very, very good as well. Ferrari had a little bit kind of up and down first day. They were saying that they were experimenting with different things, ride height. They were trying to induce porpoising and then sort of back it off and see what that point was. Mercedes had a pretty good first day, had a bad second day, and then had I think a really good third day. So this is just the kind of things that happen during testing. I think people are running through all different kinds of programs, but yes, generally, to my eyes, it looked like the Red Bull was doing pretty well. Yeah.
So let's break this down for me, but also possibly for one or two listeners at home. When you say the cars look stable or balanced, are you talking about what they look like when they're cornering? Is there something to look at on the car that denotes stability? Is it the way that the driver can sweep into a corner and not correct? What are the attributes that sort of constitute balance?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because one very insightful thing that a former F1 aerodynamicist told us during our podcast was, you don't design a car to go fast in a straight line. You design a car to be fast in the corners. And that's something that maybe might not resonate with kind of the casual fan, that the engineers and the aerodynamicists are designing the cars to be as fast through the corners as possible. And then straight line speed just kind of comes, as a result of a lot of that. So being fast in the corners means having stability in the corners, which are things like rotational stability, braking stability, which is lateral. So you've got lateral acceleration for rotational stability, and then you've got you know forward and backward stability for braking and traction. And so think, if we break down a corner, for instance, then as you approach a corner, you're going from a high rate of speed to a low rate of speed for, say, let's, a low speed corner, which means you're going to have a lot of um, stability in braking. So the first thing you might look at is which teams are locking up more than others. For instance, we saw a lot of teams locking up at turn 10. That's generally a place where you're going to lock up at, in Bahrain. So that's one thing to look at. How much braking traction do teams have? And then how does a car rotate through a corner? So generally what you're doing is, as you're turning a car, you're generating moments, and those moments are actually what's rotating a car through a corner. So things like, as a driver is putting steering lock into the tires, is it actually responding? Are they having to do a lot of corrections? That's why the onboards are great, because you can see very clearly, if a driver is very smooth on the wheel, he's just giving inputs and the car is responding. But if he's giving an input and then you see a slight correction or something like that, that means that the car to him is unstable. So that's, the thing that you'll look at through, say, mid corners. You'll look at rotational stability. And then the next thing you'll look at is exit stability. So in the traction zone, where you're then applying torque to accelerate the car now out of the corner, is the rear end, for instance, compliant? Is a driver, say, having to feather the throttle a bit because they're losing traction? The most obvious thing is when you see that a driver may get into the throttle and they induce an oversteer condition, where the rear tires want to kind of swing out from basically the rear of the car wants to become the front of the car. And the driver really has to then, get out of the throttle or correct the steering wheel, to correct the oversteer moment. So those kinds of things are what I mean by when a car looks planted or when it looks compliant. The best way to tell really is to watch the onboards. How easy is it for that driver when they're putting the inputs in the car to then just simply, very smoothly go through the corners? Are they having to do a lot of corrections, things like that?
Thank you for breaking that down. I'm just imagining like being in a car or driving myself and trying to think through all of those different axes of force that you're talking about. So when you're sort of thrown back in your seat as you accelerate quickly, maybe your parents like to drive quickly and you're in a car or something. And naturally, I suppose the weight is shifting to the rear of the car, or as you slow down, the opposite's happening where you're people that have a seatbelt on might be thrown forward, and then add in turning the car at the same time. I think people have a vivid image of that. So imagine you sort of implied Red Bull looking comfortable, Aston Martin looking pretty good. Mercedes seemed to have a good final day. Who's not looking good, or who looked least comfortable? Would you say through the tests?
I'm definitely McLaren. To me, looked very uncomfortable. I think AlphaTauri as well didn't have a very good test. We'll start with McLaren. The thing with McLaren that's always puzzled me a little bit is when you look at the car, it looks pretty slick. I mean, from an aerodynamic standpoint, you kind of look at it and you think, okay, you've got the intake, which looks kind of like a version of, say, the Ferrari intakes. And then you've got a bit of the Red Bull style side pods. Even this year, they've gone to the Red Bull style side pod with the scallop cut, which is on the outboard side of the side pod. And then you've also got a little bit of a combination of the Alpine water slide as well, that's in that side pod. So it's the McLaren is like a combination of a lot of the really good things from a lot of very successful fast cars, but somehow they just can't seem to get it to translate to aerodynamic efficiency. It always seems like just a very draggy car. It seems like maybe their floor is not generated, so they have to compensate for it with, say, a big front wing and quite a large rear wing, which front wings and rear wings are much less aero efficient than the floors because the floors generate a lot of downforce without the penalty of drag. So maybe for our listeners that don't understand aero efficiency is effectively like, if you're talking about an airplane, it's the lift to drag ratio, but for race cars, it's effectively the downforce to drag ratio. So as you're generating downforce, how much penalty and drag are you paying? Things like front wings, rear wings will generate for you a lot of downforce, but they do it at a penalty of a lot of drag. Floors are much more aero efficient. So when I see a car that's draggy, what that tells me is that maybe the floor is not so effective and they're not able to produce a lot of downforce through just the floors where you would have that aero efficiency, and they have to compensate for it with a rear wing or a front wing, which can be more draggy. So I think that's possibly one of the main issues that's going on with the McLaren. They seem to have solved their braking issues they had last year. So over the course of the year, they, didn't, have braking problems, overheating the brakes anymore. So, but it just always, we called it the world's fastest brick. It just always seemed, very draggy. And it doesn't seem like they've fixed that this year. Now, unless they were just really holding back. But when you looked at the drivers' reactions, when you looked at the pit wall and you heard Lando speak, it was almost kind of depressing. I mean, I really feel like they struggled through that weekend, definitely. So I would say McLaren is definitely one of the ones that I thought probably had the worst practice.
And what a shame for Oscar Piastri. Although maybe a silver lining, it depends how you look at it. He's coming in after a year off from sort of a full time race seat. but a lot of pressure because the team is essentially paying Daniel Ricciardo upward of 20 million US dollars to stay at home. So yeah, that would be an interesting one for McLaren. Um, I think there were mixed reviews about Alpine. Do you have a view on how their testing went and what we might expect from them? Was it mixed, or did you see them struggling a bit? What was your view on them?
I mean, everything that Alpine was saying, the words that were coming out of their mouths during interviews and the reactions, I guess, from the drivers, everything seemed to indicate that they were holding back. And, when you look at their telemetry data, which is the beautiful thing about having the, you know, the testing, the 3 days of testing televised like that, is that we have access to the telemetry. So we can use Fast F1 to get the telemetry, or we can use, other available resources to basically dig into the data. And certainly it looked like they just simply didn't have the same amount of punch that the other cars did when it came to raw power, um, you know, lateral grip and things like that. But then again, when you put it into context to what teams typically do during testing, was just hold back, I think it's possible they were really holding back. Now, the Alpine last year was always one of those cars where, okay, in the hands of Fernando Alonso last year, I felt like it was quite a weapon. I mean, even Ocon himself had, some good results, and it always seemed to be like a very fast car. They had good straight line speed. Seemed like they always seemed to do quite well in qualifying, but then when it came down to the actual race and race pace, they seemed to take a step back. So I'll be interested to see, because I don't think we really were able to get a very good read on that during testing, what Alpine has to offer. Definitely the car looks like an evolution from the previous year's car, so nothing incredibly drastic, small little changes here and there. But it's going to be really interesting to see what they bring to the table, because they were very strong last year.
Yeah, they were strong, and I think there's a bit of pressure on Alpine. I mean, they've moved on Otmar Safnauer. They put him in, I think, an untenable position in the sense that they basically weren't keeping him up to date on the driver contractual situations. So he was defending a position that actually wasn't Alpine's position. They lost two major drivers. They would argue, or have attempted to argue, they wanted their current lineup, all French. Gasly quite a bit to prove, I think, stepping out from the shadow of Red Bull. So it should be an interesting season. And as you say, they, on occasion, were threatening Mercedes in qualifying, only to perhaps drop back as a distant fourth on race pace. So here's my question, because we're here. It's a Thursday evening, coming up to 9 o'clock. We had the news today that Lance Stroll has been declared fit to race. I think he had a broken wrist. So we've talked a little bit about stability and cornering. What's it going to be like trying to turn a car with that amount of force going through it, with a wrist that clearly wasn't in a good enough state to test only a week ago? How do you think that could affect him and his performance this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine, when I heard that he was going to drive, I thought there was no way that he was going to be able to make it. But it seems that the doctor that he saw, I can't remember the name of the doctor, but I think it's the same doctor that does a lot of the MotoGP, uh, riders' surgeries whenever they have injuries and things like that. Must have done some kind of magic trick. I'm pretty sure that he did have surgery. So part of me is kind of wondering, did they use some sort of a stabilizing plate or a rod or something like that in the wrist, just to keep it stable so that he's able to, maybe get through the season this year, and then maybe have some corrective surgery after that. Whatever the case is definitely going to be put to the test from what we've heard. Um, you know, they actually put him on the simulator. They put Stroll on the simulator, and they doubled the loads that would typically go through his arms and such from the steering, and just to make sure that he was okay. I would say Formula One is maybe the one place where you could potentially get away with it, say compared to like in the US with IndyCar, where it's not, it's very, IndyCar is very physically demanding because the amount of force input you have to put through the wheel for an Indy car is completely different than from an F1 car. I mean, an F1 car is effectively like power steering versus, no power steering for an Indy car. So I think if there is a car where, he could potentially do this, it would be in an F1 car just because it is, very there's mechanical advantage for him basically to not have to stress his arms as much. But the other part of that is, you know, one thing that I was listening to the podcast, what was it, F1 Beyond the Grid with Charles Leclerc, and they were asking Charles about the braking force that you have to put into the brake pedal to get the F1 cars to actually brake. And I mean, I think they said something like 80 kilos or 90 kilos of load. And he was talking about how, some drivers don't actually put all that load through the brake pedal with their foot. So they don't, use their leg muscles to apply, say, 80 or 90 kilos, but they allow that braking force. So as they're braking and the G's, are pulling them forward, they their body movement, they use that advantage of their body moving to actually help apply the load. And so I imagine for Stroll, if you were going to do that, you would need to brace yourself with your arms on the wheel to be able to keep your upper body from moving. So, more than likely for Stroll, they're going to probably have to run his belts incredibly tight to where he's got no movement at all. So that when he is in the braking zone, that load is not coming through his arms, and so it's all being taken at his chest. So I don't know, what type of a driver Stroll is in terms of, what is his method when it comes to braking? Does he use some of his body movement to help him brake? And if that's no longer available, will that also affect him? So there's a lot of different unknowns there. I think they will see probably during free practice, as he's running through the paces, how he's handling it once he's in a real car. And I imagine, you've still got Felipe Drugovich over there. So I imagine if something goes, south, then they can effectively put Drugovich in the car. But I wasn't too excited to see the way that they handled it, though, with Drugovich. You definitely, from the interviews today, it looked like Drugovich was completely surprised and caught off guard.
It's a, Lance Stroll gets a lot of flack, and I think some of it comes from just the fact that his dad has bankrolled his career. He's not the only driver whose dad has bankrolled their career, but there's something around, people perceiving that Lance Stroll basically has a lifetime contract in that team, and it is a shame for Felipe Drugovich. He is a good driver, and he will be on standby. The point you made about the braking and bracing his body under braking with that 80 kilos of force that he's trying to apply through the brake pedal, I hadn't even thought about that. My amateur logic was going to say, I just looked on Twitter and I think it's his right arm or right wrist that's gone. And so my logic thought, well, we're on we're on a clockwise circuit, so more right turns than left. And I would have thought that you'd be using your left. This is my silly logic. You can tell me it was wrong. Use your left hand to turn the wheel in more than your right, but maybe you don't. I don't know. I've never driven an F1 car. Is there anything in that needing to go clockwise might mean more use of the left hand side of your body, or nothing at all? What do you think?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think maybe if you were talking about, like I said, like IndyCar, where you're having to put way more load into the wheel to get the car to rotate, possibly, yeah. I think, maybe for an F1 car, it's marginally different. It's the same sort of steering input that you would have whether you're going left or right. It'll be interesting to see in the lateral G loads, in the high speed corners and things like that. Is there going to be, I don't know, a propensity for him to maybe take some lateral loads through his arms, possibly, as he's holding onto the wheel. Is his wrist going to want to fold over, let's say, for instance, due to lateral loads, because the rest of his upper body, I mean, his arm is going to want to move towards the outer straight of the corner, right? And his wrist is going to have to compensate for that. So, I don't know. I thought the guy was going to probably roll out with maybe some I don't know, some wrist guards on or something like that. I think of when you used to go rollerblading and you'd wear these stiff wrist guards on, like, I mean, something just to keep his wrist taut, because but then again, he's going to need to have that dexterity to be able to feel the wheel, because a lot of driving is all about feel. You know, you can talk to, any driver, and they'll tell you that, they can feel when you're on the limit, like when the tires are screaming, and maybe you're about to lose traction. I mean, it's a feel thing through their arms, through their whole body. So how is that going to affect his feel as well? Is he going to be able to respond when he kind of feels that the car is, say, on the edge? Is he even going to be able to take it to the edge? I mean, the worst thing would be, obviously, if he's unfit to be out there and then something ends up happening, as a result of him being unfit. That would be the worst thing. But I expect probably we'll get at some point, whether it's in free practice or, in between sessions or something like that. Obviously, they'll be assessing and ensuring that he's fit to drive.
The more I think of it, the more I think it's a big ask. Stroll has not driven the car in anger this year, or at least not done long runs. So he's sort of, let's say, a day and a half behind all other drivers in terms of experience. And we're not just talking about the race. Of course, you've got to set the car up. Now, yes, of course, they've had testing at the same track, but you've got free practices 1, 2, and 3. So that's 3 hours of potential running. You've got qualifying, where I'm sure the Aston Martin crew will be wanting to be solidly in Q3, particularly after the hype of this season so far. And then the race. So before you even get to the race, you've got 2 full days, solid days. And for those of you that have done a bit of go-karting, sometimes I'm not a killjoy, but sometimes you're begging for it to end because your arms are absolutely knackered. These guys are professionals, but if Stroll's had that time off, and these, the forces you're talking about, it's no mean feat if he pulls it off. So, I mean, I'm rooting for him to stay safe and to perform, and hopefully he can do the car justice. So tell me, Obbs, tell me a little bit about your podcast. Let's do a little commercial break and talk about the Tech Heads F1 podcast. I was on Twitter earlier and I saw a lot of feedback, lots of quote tweets, lots of people saying, look, tune in if you want to understand the concepts behind Formula One. You guys talking a lot about gurney flaps, etc. What's the Tech Heads F1 podcast all about?
Yeah, good question. I think when Bryson and I started thinking about what we wanted to do with a potential podcast, we knew that there was a need out there for something that was very tech focused. I mean, for anybody that follows, myself or Bryson, you'll know that, or Molly as well. I mean, all of us, you'll know that we're very technically minded. So we look at testing, and where everybody was saying, oh, it was boring, we were completely geeking out because we were looking at every single little flick up on the floor edge and every single little twist in the diffuser or the floor and those kinds of things. That's what our podcast is all about. It's all about, like, the technical things. And I think we're all very complimentary of one another in the sense that, Bryson and I have some background in aerodynamics and fluid mechanics. And, Molly has background in powertrains and engines and things like that. So I think generally we've almost got the car completely covered. Maybe, suspension dynamics and things are a bit where, across the board we're weak. But I would say, we've had some great guests on. And that's the main thing that we really like, is to bring people in. Now, we will be the first to tell anybody who asks that we are not experts. None of us have worked in Formula One before. So we're not coming in with this, position of, yeah, we've been there, done that kind of thing. We're coming in with a sound, engineering background and understanding and an insatiable appetite to learn. And that's how we've learned the things that we have, is just by asking questions and reading and having conversations. And we thought, you know what, these conversations that we have with each other and with other people, it would be really great to document these in a podcast and to just kind of spread the technical love, so to speak, to where other people could learn as well. So at its core, our podcast is really just an opportunity for us to learn and for us to learn together with you, the listener. And I think that's what we're most proud about, is that we're just out there just to try to gain an understanding of this crazy Formula One world that we love so much, and try to understand why teams do some of the things that they do and why cars are behaving the way that they behave. But we've got the podcast. We also have started our YouTube page, and on our YouTube page, we listened to our listeners, and some of them said, "Hey, we love to hear you guys speak, but we're so visual, and sometimes we can't see what you're talking about. So we would love to see some videos." So we started doing things called tech bites now on our YouTube page, and that's exactly what it is. It's kind of expanding on something from the podcast or something that's being discussed, in the technical world at the moment, and giving a bit of explanation that's a visual explanation so people can learn that way as well. And we also have an Instagram account, which is also, again, another way to kind of visually show things, whether it's short form media or images and things like that. So, yeah, Tech Heads F1 is just really all about learning together.
You've both got, or all three of you, sorry, I should say, have got fantastic voices. So, you could get a professional deal with, I don't know, the Calm app or something, because it's both informative and sort of mellow and relaxing. Fantastic. I can see on your YouTube page that you've already got 18,000 views on a video that you released just 2 weeks ago on the W14's double hump cover. So do check out at Tech Heads F1. I think that's the handle for everything.
Everything, yep. Mm-hmm.
You did your research, which I should.
We make it easy.
Yeah,
we make
exactly.
it easy for everyone.
Fantastic. So brilliant. No, I'm already subscribed on Google Podcast and looking forward to your tech bites as you go through the year. Fantastic. So returning to the field, the runners and riders, we've broken down, for those that are just joining, that Red Bull are looking quite good up front, and we've talked a bit about what that means in terms of stability. What can you tell from testing? It's not just the times, as I found out with a graphic of different times, and was told a few times by particularly Aston Martin fans that they were meaningless. So we talked a bit about Red Bull, we talked a bit about Aston Martin, and just recently talked about Lance Stroll. We looked at those that perhaps are struggling, McLaren coming to mind the most. So there's been some other news today, which is around Lewis Hamilton's contract. And rather than it being the news that many Team LH members might be after, which is, yes, Lewis has signed another multi-year deal, it is Lewis clapping back, I think, at Jenson Button and Damon Hill for speculating that he might be departing the sport or unwilling to continue if the car continues in its current state. So here's a question, and we're going to start to turn up the temperature on these takes, asking you to be slightly risky. For W14, do you think it's going to give Lewis a platform that will allow him to win a race or be there or thereabouts this season?
Good question. I'm deep down a very emotional person, but I'm also a very analytical person. So when you ask me those questions internally, I'm very conflicted in how I'm going to answer this. But I'll say this: let's compare. I mean, and number one, look, Lewis Hamilton is one of the greatest drivers of all time. Okay, let's just get that off the table. And if there's anybody that can extract something out of a car, it's him. The W13, we all know, this storied history of of the fickle beast that is the W13. And that platform at the start of the year was incredibly unstable. It was porpoising and bouncing like, like we say in Texas, like a bucking bronco. And if we have to compare that to where they're starting this year with the W14, the W14 looks way more stable than the W13. It does not appear to show any, signs of bouncing or porpoising. It did struggle a little bit during testing with some rear instability. They had on the second day, some issues with losing front end downforce, which they now say they've solved and they've figured it out. What we still don't know yet is whether or not they were able to solve some of the drag issues. So that was something that did plague the W13 was straight line, speed, drag. We have seen that they do have a medium downforce wing that they've brought to Bahrain now, and it looks like at least in FP1 they're going to maybe do a side by side with the high downforce wing they used during testing and the new medium downforce wing. So we'll see kind of how that might affect rear end stability. But if we talk about, is the W14 going to give Lewis a platform to be successful during the year, I think it's already starting out better than the W13, so we can establish that. But it's definitely too early to know that for sure. If I just can speak to the pedigree of the team that is Mercedes, obviously the pedigree is there for them to find success and to develop the car. They showed during the course of the year with the W13, they came quite a long way, right, with it. By the end of the year, we're able to, get a race win. And frankly, I mean, George Russell did quite well, right? I mean, when you look at the number of podiums that he had over the course of the year when he was, driving that kind of a car. But I think Lewis is the type of driver that you're going to have to drag him away from the sport. He just seems like he's just a driver through and through. And I just don't think he's, fast car or not, he's ever going to accept defeat, because that just doesn't seem like him. So he's always going to be one to accept a challenge. And the W13 was a challenge and he accepted that challenge, aside from maybe in Baku when we all thought that, he might not make it through the season without spending time in hospital. But it seemed like they dialed that stuff out. And now, he's again accepting the challenge of this year of the W14. So yes, I do think that the W14 will give him a platform to be successful. What does successful mean, though? How do you define success? I think Mercedes is a victim of their own success in the sense that for many of their fans, and probably for Lewis Hamilton, last year was a complete reset of expectations. They had gotten so used to dominating and winning. What do you do now with that expectation that you have and that you've gotten used to of just being the top team, and then all of a sudden you weren't? So how is he handling that this year? How is that gonna be if, say, the W14 is still maybe third place car battling for a race win here and there? I just think Lewis still has that fire in him that he's just going to keep going and he's going to accept the challenge. But I think the W14 is definitely in a better place than the W13 was. And the pedigree of the team is such a pedigree that they will find pace during the year.
And I can only hope. I mean, it's just night and day looking at testing from last year and this year. And indeed, if I recall the Bahrain Grand Prix, I'm still scarred because I think both Lewis and George switched onto the hard tyres and just went backwards, and were I think the only team to run that, and only got the podium with Lewis because both Red Bulls retired at the end of the race.
And I'm
scarred
from that as well. So,
well, we should hype you up by switching to Red Bull. But before we do, just one final technical story on Mercedes. So Ted Kravitz was talking about the Mercedes power unit and the fact that we're now obviously in the engine freeze. And he suggested that Mercedes played it too safe. So they arrived in 2022 with a much more reliable power unit than their competitors. But indeed, that has prevented them from advancing under the engine freeze when other manufacturers can bring in upgrades that are related only to reliability. Some people have dismissed that speculation from Kravitz, but do you think there could be any merit to that as a way of gaming the system?
I think this is something that Alpine has been very outspoken about last year. We saw that Alpine really struggled with PU reliability, right? I mean, Alonso was definitely not too happy with the water pump issues that they had with their particular setup. But, and Alpine said, they came out openly and said, look, we went very aggressive with the engine as far as performance settings and things like that, and what levels we run it at and how we've designed it. And I think Ferrari even did the same thing, right? We famously know about their struggles as well with their reliability and the fact that they had to turn the engine down. And if rumors are true, they've now been able to address some of those reliability issues and are now able to run the PU at full beans, as you say here in the UK. What did Mercedes do? Gosh, it's such a hard thing because the only thing we've really got to go on is speculation and what Ted is saying. Granted, he's connected, he spends time there in the paddock, so he hears the paddock rumors and things like that. But what we did hear at the beginning of last year was that there was one particular team who was struggling with the switch to the new fuel, and that speculation was, well, Ferrari did quite good, Honda did quite good, well, who's left, right? That it was maybe Mercedes. And then when we saw that some of the Mercedes powered teams were down in the speed traps or were struggling a bit, then those speculations started to turn into kind of a raging wildfire of what people felt like was truth, that the Mercedes PU was just simply down on power and they just hadn't stretched it. It was the most reliable PU on the grid. Honda famously for a long time was struggled with reliability, but finally is able to provide a reliable product, to Red Bull Racing, and they had quite a good year, but even they weren't as reliable as the Mercedes PU over the course of the year. So, definitely there's some truth to the fact that they have developed a reliable unit. Now, whether or not they've developed a unit that is not, say, stretching the boundaries of performance, I can't say. I mean, I could speculate, but I know that Bryson on the podcast had Stuart Mitchell from Race Car Engineering, who pretty much debunked the comment that Mercedes had struggled with the change to the E10 fuel, and said that that was not true. So, and he's quite connected as well. So, who knows who knows what we can believe here. I think the W13 was draggy, so that probably was maybe making the PU look a bit weaker than maybe it really was. But if you compare Mercedes power units this year, for this new regulation to maybe where they were previously, it really doesn't seem like they have an engine advantage anymore, a PU advantage like they used to have, and so when you don't have that, you need to be extremely aerodynamically efficient. You need to be mechanically efficient when it comes to cornering, right? You need to be able to make up for it somehow. And maybe when you bring all those things together, it's possible that that might explain some of the struggles they've had as well. I don't know. There's a lot of puzzle pieces on the table, and honestly, I'm not able to put them together yet.
Well, your media training's kicking in there. That's a very, very good way to move back to a neutral position. A few interesting points that you bring out there around the fuel. And when I was watching testing, there was a really fascinating moment where Pat Simmons, whatever you think of him for his involvement in Singapore and Crashgate, he was talking about how actually a lot earlier than we would imagine, he was saying to, I think his boss would have been, it wouldn't have been John Todd because he was in the FIA, but Ross Brawn, I guess, saying, look, we need to get ahead of the game on sustainability. And how can we do that? We can do that on fuel. So it'll be fascinating to see any gains. I don't know if the fuels are locked in or whether there's still that opportunity to enhance. Is it E20 that we're on now before we move to a fully sustainable fuel? I can't remember E20.
No, I think we're on the E10. E10, right?
I was over ambitious.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Red Bull, right? Let's hype you up, Red Bull. Really fascinating comments have come out in the last couple of days from Alexander Albon, talking about how sensitive the Red Bull has been to drive. And I was going to say one model, but actually it probably dates back till, whenever Max Verstappen had a full winter and full development on a car. And he likened it to playing Call of Duty with the sensitivity turned up full, so that when you're trying to move your aim across the screen, it's moving rapidly when you just do a small input. He said, to quote, there was so much nose on the thing that if you blew on the wheel, the car would turn. So could you help our listeners, yeah, exactly. Could you help our listeners understand what that means? How would you get that sensitivity into a car? And do you think that, again, is something that we can take as now a fact, that that's something that Max has in his car and he really enjoys above others?
Yeah, so good. We're stretching the boundaries of my technical skills here when we start talking about cornering dynamics. But what I can tell you is, first thing, Max definitely, is on record as liking a pointy car, as you call it. So when you say something is on the nose, that means that, it is on the limit of being into an oversteer condition, right? So maybe for the listeners, let's kind of define that first. So if you're going into a corner and you're putting steering input, which says, okay, my turn is going to the left. I want the car to go to the left, so I'm going to turn the wheel to the left. As I turn the wheel to the left, the car responds. Does it respond quickly? And so quickly to where now the rear of the car is trying to, like we say, come around to the front. That is what you would call an oversteer condition. So you're putting in so much front steering input, the nose is responding incredibly quickly, and the rear simply just can't catch up to it. So it just rotates all the way around, basically pivots around the front axle. That would be an oversteer condition. The opposite of that is what's called understeer, where if you're then putting in the input, you start to have then a slip angle, and instead of, say, 15% angular, turn in, you're getting, say, 10%, or you're only getting 5%, right? So the steering input that you're putting does not match the direction of the car. So what happens is it starts to drift to the outside of the corner, and then you actually don't make the corner. Then in that case, that's called an understeer condition. So when you have a very pointy nose, or a car that's on the nose, that means that you're going to have a tendency to be more into the oversteer condition. So you're going to have to be okay managing the rear of the car, keeping that part under control. Now, every driver is different. Some drivers like the understeer, some drivers like the oversteer. One thing that drivers say nowadays is that because the cars are so heavy, that when you get into kind of an oversteer condition and the back end starts to rotate, the momentum that there is in that rotation moment is so high, because the cars weigh more, that you simply cannot correct. You can't catch it. So more drivers nowadays don't like that, because they feel like they can live with understeer and they simply can't save a car when it goes into an oversteer moment. So that's the one thing to put into context with these cars. So when Max likes that, that is going to naturally be much harder to drive for someone that is not used to that, right? So if Alex Albon's coming in, he, doesn't like a car that's on the nose, it's going to be very difficult for him to come to grips with that. Same thing right? That was one of the things that was talked about over the course of last year, was that, look, they've developed a car and they've developed it in Max's direction, and Checo just doesn't like the same kind of a car. He doesn't like it pointy like Max likes it. And so he's really struggling. And the reason why he did so well at the beginning of the year is because it was more understeery. And part of that is also due to sometimes, the overall weight of the car. So as you lighten a car, you're able to then, rotate it easier. As it's heavier, you then have more tendency towards understeer condition. So that could have been part of it. But I guess what I would say is it would not surprise me if the RB18 or the RB19 this year is difficult to drive, or the RB, you know, 16B and the RB16. I mean, all those cars, you see the amount of drivers that they went through who had, whether it was Gasly or it was, I mean, Albon or whoever was sitting there in the other seat, struggled a bit, but it seems like Max always seemed to get a handle of it. I think there's probably some truth to that. The other aspect of this is that there's an aerodynamic component to this. So every car has what's called a center of pressure. And that center of pressure is like a center of gravity. Okay. So center of gravity is, I mean, they're fundamentally different, but you can think of them kind of in the same way. Center of gravity is if you took all the mass of the car, the point at which the whole mass of the car acts in a single point, where when it, you have a load distribution of the weight over the front axle and over the rear axle, where is that point? That's the center of gravity. So it's not only front to back in that direction, but it's also up and down in the height direction. All of those things affect how easily or how much inertia a car has as it tries to turn through a corner. Center of pressure now is different in that center of pressure is a point where all of the aerodynamic forces are effectively acting, right? So it's like a 50-50 split. If you think of the front axle and the rear axle and you draw a line right in the middle of it, that's the 50% point. That's the center of pressure being dead even between the front and rear axle. Most cars are not like that. Most cars are set up with a rear bias center of pressure. So maybe 10% more towards the rear tire. So it might be 60% on the rear tire, 40% on the front tire, right? So you can affect how pointy a car is by adding more front wing, which means that you start to then shift the center of pressure more forward, which means you're getting a bit more downforce on the front wheels, which means that the front wheels are gripping more into a corner. Maybe the rear axle is not gripping as much, so it might have a tendency to slide. Again, now you're creating an oversteer condition. Or you can shift the center of pressure more rearward by backing off the front wing, maybe increasing the rear wing, and then you get what's called more rearward aero balance, and then that would be more of an understeer condition. So that is a very long-winded answer to a simple question, to say that there's a mechanical component to it, which is how all of the masses of the car are set up, how the suspension is set up, to where when you put a steering input into the car, how does the car dynamically respond? How does the weight respond then to that moment, to that action? And then how does the car then rotate through a corner because of the center of gravity? And then how is the aerodynamics set up in a way that also allows you to either have a pointy or a not so pointy car? So aerodynamics is something you can control. As a car has been built, the weights have been distributed across the car itself. So there's not a lot you can do there usually, but you can affect the aerodynamics. So for instance, Checo might run maybe a little bit more front wing, or sorry, a little less front wing than maybe Max does. So these are things that teams can do to try to help the driver who maybe is struggling a little bit. But yeah, I would believe that probably the RB18 or the RB19 this year is probably quite a fickle beast.
Yeah, I mean, they pay these guys a lot, so these cars better be difficult to drive. but some more difficult than others. Who knows? Um, okay, so there's this is the crunch time now. I'm gonna set the question up. It's gonna be about what do you think will surprise us this year. But while I give you some time to really process that, we often have seasons that flatter to deceive. Last season, I would say, would be one of those. So, for example, uh, Max Verstappen, after the first two races, was a long way back. Naturally, he'd had mechanical issues with the car. Some would say fuel issues, but we won't speculate, and so on. And clearly, he clawed that back quite easily. And by the midway point, it was quite clear he was going to win the season. Clear in the other direction, we left Abu Dhabi in 2021 thinking that perhaps Lewis Hamilton was destined for vengeance in 2022, and the W13 came and basically rained on all of our parades. So I suppose there were some surprises and not so surprises last year. What's going to surprise us? It could be any car or any performer in the field. What's going to surprise us about the 2023 season?
I think so far, the surprise that we've had is that the speculation about how the cars were going to be 1 second to maybe a second and a half slower per lap because they raised the floor and they increased the diffuser throats it been debunked now. These cars are faster than they were last year. The engineers have done an exceptional job of bringing downforce back when, the regulations changed to try to obviously, slow the cars down a bit and reduce some of the downforce. So that's the first surprise. And I think that will continue throughout the year. I think as we look at the times and we compare them to 2022, I think we're going to see that the cars are indeed faster and they will get even faster as the year goes on. So I think that's my first surprise. I think the Aston Martin for me is, I'm either going to look like a hero or zero with this one, but during testing last year, the McLaren looked so good and then all of a sudden just, completely fell on its face. But I don't know. I look at the Aston, I see the lateral G's they were able to, put down in the corners and the high speed corners during testing. That's not something that you can sandbag. So there's some real performance in the car there. It looks to have some good straight line speed. I mean, it's got a Mercedes power unit in it, but it looks slippery, which means it looks, like it's got some really good aerodynamic efficiency. They've got Fernando Alonso at the wheel, who's a complete demon when you give him a car. So I really think that Aston Martin is going to make a major jump up the grid this year compared to last year. And I think we'll see Stroll perform this year. We talked about it. You said it, Blag. I mean, Stroll catches some heat. People think he's just, the pay driver that's just there out for a ride, but he's got some talent. He really does. When he's not driving into other drivers, but it's that to me, I think is another thing. So Aston Martin, I think they're going to have a good result. And honestly, fourth in the constructors for them would be exceptional. That would be a major jump up for them. Another team that I'm kind of keeping my eye on cautiously is the Alfa Romeo. At the hands of Bottas. I mean, Guan Yu Zhou, I mean, he was doing quite well, during the year. I mean, before he had his crash at Silverstone, and even after Silverstone, he had a few good results. But has Alpha given them a car that they can actually drive this year? We know the Ferrari PU is strong, right? And they have a Ferrari PU in that car. And when I look at the car, it looks good. It's got that Red Bull downwashing side pod design, and it looks pretty slick. The floor edge looks pretty good as well. And I think, this car should be fast. And they put down a couple good times during testing, but again, as you say, we really can't pay attention to the test times. But Alfa Romeo may be a surprise. They're not going to be a fifth in the constructors, I don't think, but they'll probably be ahead of McLaren. I think down at the bottom, from what I've seen so far, is maybe McLaren and Williams. Sadly, Williams. Gosh, I want Williams to do so well. I really do. But I think Williams is going to have another rough year. So yeah, if I had, maybe those aren't spicy enough takes, but I would say Aston Martin is probably. I'm putting my chips down. I'm saying Aston Martin is going to have a really good year, and I'm looking at a fourth in the constructors for them.
Fantastic. Okay, well, if you're at home listening to this, you can already reflect on whether Dr.Obbs is looking good after qualifying, or whether perhaps there's already a risk to his prediction. I think they're fair predictions. I do hope on the Alfa Romeo side that they have a good start. Last year, I think Bottas had a fantastic start. He ended up with something like 50 points, 49 points, but nearly all of those were scored in the first half of the season. And I think that was something to do with the Ferrari having, as an engine supplier, having a fantastic first third of the season. So let's see. That'll be fantastic. The thing we can't forget is that this weekend isn't just the kickoff for Formula One, it's the kickoff for IndyCar. And with IndyCar, you get Indy NXT, as it's now called, formerly Indy Lights. So 10 minutes, I think, before the start of the Bahrain Grand Prix, which I'm reliably informed starts at 3 p.m. UK time on Sunday, 2:50 UK time, I think it's 9:50 local, in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is, I think, near Tampa Bay. You will have Jamie Chadwick starting in her Indy Next career in the first race of the season. So we wish her luck. We wish Miles Rowe luck in the USF 2000 Pro Series, which is the next rung down in what was called the Road to Indy. It's going to be a fantastic weekend. And I think, Dr.Obbs, I think you did give us enough spice there. Maybe I'll check with my compadre, the unforgettable AMG Dens, who will determine whether there's enough Caribbean spice on the meat, as it were. Before we go, because this has been a fantastic episode so far, so many insights explained so clearly to me, at the very least, and I'm sure some of our friends at home. What are you looking forward to in 2023? Have you got any projects? I know you're working on a fantastic podcast, but anything we should look out for, or anything you want to highlight or shout out?
Yeah, I think definitely keep an eye on our YouTube space. We're going to be doing a lot more, like we said, with the visual medium to bring, more opportunities to learn. I think personally as well, over the course of the year, I'm really looking to get a bit back into computational fluid dynamic modeling. So it's something that I did in grad school, when I was working on my PhD, and I did some computational fluid dynamics. And you see all these beautiful CFD studies that, aerodynamicists have done, where you've got a model of a car and you can see how the air is moving over the car. You see all the vortices that are being generated. And just to have that skill sharpened again for myself is something I'm going to be working towards this year, to try to bring that back. So might be some opportunities then to be able to do a bit more content creation around, CFD studies and things. And maybe I'll stretch myself as well. Might partner with a few people who I know quite well in the industry, and maybe write a paper or two potentially. That would be a stretch goal. I don't know. I have a career I need to keep alive as well. But those are some things I'm really kind of setting for myself as goals for the year. But as a short-term goal, I definitely want to, and we want to, through Tech Heads and a lot of things that we're doing with the YouTubes, really expand the visual space, the visual medium, short form content, long form content, and things like that. I definitely need to upgrade my setup here, get maybe a better camera and some cool pens that I can do more, drawings on the videos and things like that. So there'll be some upgrades there. But yeah, that's really it for me. I think maybe just kind of increasing the content footprint a bit, growing the footprint of the tech heads, fan base, I guess. I don't know. That feels weird to say fan base, but honestly, I really appreciate everybody who reaches out and gives us comments as well on ways that we can also improve, because we do listen and we take those things to heart. And it's why we started the YouTube. It's why we started doing the visual medium as well. So yeah, I think focus on those things really will be growing the content. Yeah.
Trust you to and Molly and Bryson to take an engineering approach to your podcast. I'm sure you've got some sort of evaluation framework, and you are you're following. You're looking at the KPI and thinking carefully how you can maximize performance. So fantastic, brilliant. Well, do check out the Tech Heads F1 podcast, available in all good podcast platforms. Do also not forget to subscribe to Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast. And I'm going to give,
Absolutely.
thank you, I'm going to give my co-host, MG Dens, a shout out. So for those of you that don't know, because he's actually like quite a modest guy, he doesn't shout out his sim racing very much on this show, but I've watched him at the Bathurst 12 hours. He did a few hours in Daytona. No spoilers, but go and check out what happened with him and Mike Fowler, his co-driver. And he's just got a brand new livery for his car. I'm really bad at cars that are not single-seater, so I'm just going to say car. I think it might be a Lamborghini, but just don't quote me on that.
It is the Lamborghini
yeah,
GT3.
right.
Yes, absolutely.
See, yes, I got it right. I got the word right. I was not going to attempt the number. But he's got a fantastic special livery on it, and I'm not going to reveal what's on there. But there's a connection to this podcast. There's a connection to the Tech Heads F1, and there's a connection to other people that are special in AMG Den's life. So go to AMG Dens on YouTube and have a look. He's done a few test runs in the car, a livery reveal, and you'll see what I mean. Fantastic.
Absolutely. Hey, I've got so much. Let me give AMG
Go
Den
on.
some flowers too here while we're at it, because I myself just started getting a bit into sim racing. I did a bit of karting when I was younger, not anything like like other people did, but and now I've got 3 kids, and so I came up with an excuse to get my kids a PlayStation 5 and some sim racing gear. And now probably use it more than they do, but I've got so much respect for Dens and what he's doing with the sim racing. It is so much harder than it looks. I mean, really, when you're talking about the full race simulators with the complete, physics environments, it's not easy to drive those cars and extract performance out of them, even in the digital space. So yeah, giving AMG Dens his flowers. I really appreciate the shout out on the livery as well. I'm super chuffed about that.
Fantastic livery. And some of us like to joke with AMG Dens because we give him his flowers. He is a man of many talents. I think he is responsible for the livery. And he can play guitar, he can do many things. Go and look at his golf swing on Twitter, because I have to just keep him humble. I have to keep him modest, his feet on the ground. Go and check out his golf swing on Twitter. Some entertaining videos there. Fantastic. Well, look, it's been a real pleasure to have you again on the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time and distilling some of your wisdom for me and for those at home. Any final messages before we wrap?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I have to say, Georgie, Dens, I mean, Blag yourself, Georgie Stripping the Dippin' was one of the first podcasts that ever invited me to be on, by the way. And that was when, I was just a new kind of F1 tech content creator and just a couple hundred followers. And Georgie reached out. And so I've got a special place in my heart for Georgie Stripping the Dippin'. So whenever you guys come calling, I always answer the call. I love being on the podcast. And I love just the amount of different guests that you have. from all different mediums, all different spaces of the sport. It's brilliant. So if you are not subscribed to this podcast, subscribe. You will not regret it. There's so much great content. There's no way that we on Tech Heads could ever match the amount of content that comes through Georgie stripping the dipping. I mean, you guys are busy fools, and Georgie must be like an editing machine or something, because that is like the worst part about having a podcast. But yeah, I'm a big fan, and just my same personal message that I always give, for my sign off: be kind to others. This is a fantastic sport that we love, Formula One. It can at times be toxic, in the digital space, right? Twitter and YouTube and all those things. But look across at your brothers and sisters across the screen and know that that is a human being just like you, and be kind.
Thank you. What a lovely sign off. And I would say that Georgie and Dens are two of the kindest people I know, whereas I am sneaky, because what I like to do is hire people that I know are going to be great successes, and then ride their coattails to the top. So it's not just about Georgie and Dens, but it's also about you and Brighton. And it's especially about Taylor Ferns, Miles Rowe, Colin Queen, and all the other fantastic people from motorsport we've had on that are destined for success. I'm going to be insufferable and all over every paddock, particularly in the US, from here on out. Yeah, let's see if people take that seriously. But look, it's been fantastic to have you. Thank you, everyone that's made it to the end. And listen, do subscribe to the podcast. Do give us a review. Do share our content. We don't market the podcast, so we rely on word of mouth. So fantastic words like those of Dr.Obbs just now mean a lot, and they do a lot for us as well. So this has been F1 Blag. This has been another episode of season 2 of our formidable podcast, Georgie Stripping the Dipping. And so that Georgie can go to sleep, because it's now 3:30 in the morning in Sri Lanka, it's been good night from Dr.Obbs, and it's good night from me. See you soon. Bye.